A short, hopefully very short discussion of how to put together an introduction in general and in particular for a literary paper. Just to give credit where credit is due, this material is adapted in part from the rhetoric textbook, The Craft of Argument, written by Joseph Williams and Gregory Colomb. So just so you know, if you want to use that as a reference, it is a useful rhetoric and writing handbook that has all kinds of information that can help you kind of think through alternate ways of writing. So some of the terminology that I'm going to be using in this video is adapted from them, although some of the structures and the way that I'm using it will not be used exactly in the ways that they're talking about. So the way I want to talk about introductions, very often when you have introductions from class to class to class, people will use different kinds of vocabulary to talk about introductions, or they'll give you different types of steps. You may have heard of different ways that you might be encouraged to start an introduction. But I'm going to make the proposition that for the vast majority of your classes, there are essentially 3 different stages to an introduction. And while those stages might look different from class to class, the basic stages are still the same. So if you know how to recognize what those stages are, it can really help you to figure out exactly how to put that together for any class. And then I'm going to more specifically talk to you about how you can think through those stages and what those might look like specifically for a literature class. So to get very specific, when you're looking at an introduction, those stages basically follow a sort of starting off from a kind of place of solidity, roughing up that solidity, and then kind of resolving that roughness or that uncertainty that you've created. That's essentially what we might think of as the sort of emotional topography of an introduction. And so basically, the stages that you want to be thinking of when you're looking at an introduction are as follows. You want to have what is called a common ground, a destabilizing condition, and a thesis. Now, for some longer or more complex arguments, you might also have a sort of stealth or optional step that comes between the destabilizing condition and the thesis, where you actually go through and step by step narrate what your steps of your argument would be. But really, in most papers, and in particular, most shorter papers, that is often a little bit of an artificial step and one that you don't necessarily need to go through. So let's talk about these different steps and what they mean and what they do. Okay, so your common ground you can think of as the kind of information that is the kind of information that no reasonable person would ever disagree with. It establishes the topic, a shared point of reference for you and your reader. It's part of the place where you essentially gain trust with your reader, that you are also establishing a little bit of your credibility with the reader, and you're easing them into the topic under discussion. Okay, so you're going to basically announce the topic. It might be a text. If you're in a course that has some kind of a themed paper, you might introduce some of the key terms and discuss them. Depending on the course, what might count as common ground may differ, right? But your goal in common ground is to establish the topic, and in such a way that you are determining kind of what we already know about the topic, or to establish a kind of shared set of information about the topic that nobody's really going to disagree about. So to think about common ground, we might look at it in a couple of different ways. So some things that might be common ground, they're going to look different again from class to class. Okay, so you want to be thinking about what counts as common ground. It's going to be different from class to class. but whatever it is, it's going to be information that isn't going to be contestable. Okay, so for a course like, let's say something like a science class, right? You might think of something like a lab report. Common ground might be something like a review of the research up until this point on the topic. We often will call this the state of research or a lit review. So it might be, let's say you're doing some kind of an experiment on something, and you might say previous studies into how this particular substance reacts under these conditions have shown X, Y, and Z, give your citations, that would be common ground. No reasonable person would disagree that those are the experiments that have been done and that those are the results. Okay, that's common ground. Another form of lit review, which you may have seen yourself already in different types of literary research, might be a type of lit review where you might acknowledge some critics have looked at this topic or this text and have focused on X, while others have focused on Y. So again, that's a sort of state of the discussion so far on this topic. So what you're kind of doing is you're establishing that a particular focus of a text has already been looked at by other critics, and that they have looked at it in particular ways. You aren't necessarily saying you agree with any of them. You're just literally establishing people have looked at it and they've said these things. No reasonable person is going to dispute that in fact critics have looked at it and looked at it in those ways. Another way to establish common ground is actually even a little bit less intensive than that. You might provide an overview of the text with reference to main themes or patterns that are relevant to the argument that you are yourself going to be focusing on in your argument. So for example, you might introduce the text of King Lear, and you might say that themes of power, authority, and justification are key to King Lear. No reasonable person who has read King Lear is going to argue with that point, and you don't necessarily have to bring in a lit review to make that point. That's what we kind of call common ground. What you're going to be doing in that is kind of twofold. One, you're making an observation about the text, right, that kind of establishes a shared point of reference. And two, by doing that on a kind of meta level, you're announcing to the reader that those themes of authority, right, and sort of justness, right, those kinds of themes are going to be key to your own argument later in the paper. So common ground is basically a way to open the text, establish some credibility, and also announce your topic. Okay, so that's your first stage. Once you've established that common ground, though, you also need to essentially give a reason for why your argument is necessary. So, if everything was always common ground, we wouldn't need your paper. We wouldn't need your analysis. If everything was common ground, there would be no argumentation necessary about a text, because we all would not only know everything that we would need to know about a text, or that was possible to know about a text, we'd also all agree. Nothing would be up to interpretation. Nothing would be up for analysis. It would just be self-evident to everyone. And that is I would say, thankfully, not the state of analysis really for any text. So destabilizing condition. What is a destabilizing condition? It's what I would consider a sort of pivot moment in your introduction where we leave common ground. This is going to be a statement in your introduction that highlights what we as a community don't know or understand well enough about a text. Okay, so pragmatically, what does this mean? This is going to be a moment in the introduction where you point out an interpretive puzzle or problem that is going to be clarified by your thesis and ultimately by your larger paper. So to make this a little bit more real, we might talk about some of the texts that we've had in a class I teach. And some of the texts that we look at are King Lear and Black Panther. So I'm going to show some potential destabilizing conditions for papers that we could imagine that would analyze issues in either of those texts. So for example, for King Lear, we might have a destabilizing condition that sets up a kind of interpretive problem or puzzle, right? While let me try that again. While Killmonger claims to be avenging the wrongs of colonial and anti-Black violence, his actions within the film are much more complicated. Okay, so you can tell this isn't really making what we would consider a specific claim. Instead, what it's doing is it's setting up a kind of contradiction or a kind of tension, a friction within the text that you are then going to resolve with your thesis, which is the much more specific claim that's going to then explain the meaning of this friction or how the text eventually grants meaning or frames our understanding of this particular conflict or tension, right? So, okay, on the one hand, Killmonger is making claims and he's sort of putting himself forward as a kind of representation of a kind of avenger of very, very real injustices. And we can see in visceral, personal, and systematic ways how he has been harmed, right, by those injustices. And yet his actions within the films as represented, so as a textual figure, complicate that particular reading of him. Okay, so you are setting up a puzzle, right, for us to interpret. Okay, so that's what's being foregrounded there. You could imagine for that paper, the thesis then is going to then have to tell us how the text, how we should understand the text's ultimate resolution or reading of that conflict. Okay, so that would be your next sentence is your thesis. Okay, similarly, we see another kind of tension being played out in King Lear, right? Or in this destabilizing condition for King Lear. Okay, so King Lear ultimately restores the monarchy as an institution, but the significance of this resolution is uncertain in light of the text's larger implications. Okay, again, if you look at the way a destabilizing condition works, what it does is it reveals or it points out a kind of puzzle, a problem in the text. And what I mean by a problem is an interpretive problem that your thesis can help us to read, right? So if you think about your paper is a conceptual paper. If you've watched our thesis video or the intellectual or academic mindset video, one of the things we talk about is what kind of paper are you writing? Is it a pragmatic paper or a conceptual paper? A pragmatic paper essentially says, how do we solve this problem? What do you do to make something better? Whereas a conceptual paper asks, how do we understand X better? Here, one of the things that a destabilizing condition basically does is tells us what the thing is that we're trying to understand about the text better, where the point of disjunct is that creates an urgency for us to understand better. What's the problem? What's the puzzle? What's the confusion that the text creates that our paper is going to be responsible for helping us to resolve, to understand, to solve, to figure out as an interpretive puzzle. Okay. One thing that I'd like you to also notice in each of these cases, while the first one uses Killmonger as its subject, you'll notice that the focus in the second clause is about the film, right? Just like your thesis, you ultimately want your puzzle and your destabilizing condition to be an interpretive question about the text. The second destabilizing condition a little bit more clearly puts the focus on the text from the beginning, because the subject of that sentence is King Lear, and not King Lear the character, but King Lear the text. And kind of think through that and make sure that your destabilizing condition ultimately draws our attention to interpretive problems rather than what we might call, let's say, plot problems. We always want to be asking, what does it mean, as opposed to why did it happen? Okay, one of those is a plot question. One of those is an interpretive question or an analytical question. And ultimately, we always want to be asking analytical questions. Okay, finally, the last thing that you want to be doing in your introduction, okay, if we think about the steps we've had so far, you have first kind of set up that common ground, then you've destabilized that common ground by basically saying, okay, here are the things that we can kind of agree on that any reasonable person can recognize about the text. However, here are the places where we've got some questions, and in specific, we have a real question about this point or this problem or this puzzle. Your thesis is going to be your central claim or argument of your paper. It should provide an answer to that problem or puzzle that you just presented to your reader. It should be a clear, direct, and specific claim. Its focus should be on the text rather than a character ultimately. So it should be telling us what the text suggests, or how to read the text, or what we should understand better about the text. And it should be at the very end of your introductory paragraph. Okay, so ultimately your thesis should not tell us about society. It should not tell us about reality. It should not tell us about the world. It needs to help us to interpret the text, because that's where your evidence should be coming from and what your paper is ultimately asking us to understand better. Now, that's a pretty short and sweet introduction to the introduction. I'm not going to belabor too much the question of a thesis, because honestly, you have a whole video on thesis statements that I've already made for you. If you haven't looked at it yet, I definitely recommend you do, because of course your thesis is the most important sentence of your paper, and it is the one sentence of your paper that can by itself change the entire grade of your assignment. So I definitely recommend that you go and check that out. But otherwise, that's the introduction. Feel free to talk to me if you have any questions about it, and I hope that helps. Take care.